Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Cochran, the CEO and Executive Director of the United States Conference of Mayors, and we want to thank you for joining us for what we believe to be a very important discussion. We have all been very appalled by the increase in violence and hate crimes directed at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders over the last year. These acts have no place in our cities or our nation. And the United States Conference of Mayors has always urged mayors to speak out on all hate crimes, whenever and wherever they occur. And we have urged our police departments to report all hate crimes to the FBI. Hate crimes against the Asian people is nothing new. We had a famous mayor, Norman Netta of San Jose, who was interned along with 127,000 in the direction of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in incarcerations of over 120,000 people. And we've had a past president who has referred to the virus as the Kung flu, which has not helped either. Throughout this, I have had discussions with Mayor Lilly May Fremont, and I had several conversations over the last few months because of the increase we've seen with Asian hate crimes. And we've discussed the need to bring this together. And we've had a great leader inside our organization from day one who's helped create our Compassionate Center for Cities, and that's Mayor Greg Fisher of Louisville. So I'd like to now turn this over to Mayor Fisher for remarks and to thank all of you who are being here with us today, recognizing that we're going to do everything we can to support the good Asian people with their ancestry and true Americans. Thank you very much, Mayor Fisher.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to the entire staff. I want to thank Fremont, California Mayor Lilly May as well for organizing this webinar on this very serious and timely topic. You know, on one hand, it's a real honor that the United States Conference of Mayors has a platform to speak out against hate and discrimination of any kind. On the other hand, it is just sad that we have to do this way too often here in this country. But whenever any type of form of hate or discrimination appears, the people of America can depend on the U.S. Conference of Mayors to speak out. When we talk about timely, on March 16th, 8 people were killed in and around Atlanta, 6 of them women of Asian descent. On Monday, just this past Monday, a 65-year-old Filipina was brutally attacked in New York and was told she didn't belong here by her attack. Nonsense. 3 men who witnessed the attack stood by, didn't intervene, didn't do anything. So this is all makes your blood boil, makes your mouth bile. When you see this, it's infuriating, it's disgusting, and it's totally unacceptable. Unfortunately, it's nothing new. Such acts against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been increasing and becoming all too common in our country today. And one way we can stamp that out is to speak up. On Tuesday, President Biden announced additional actions to respond to anti-Asian violence, xenophobia, and bias actions that expand on similar efforts in a memorandum announced on the president's 6th day in office. He is a leader in this area that we are all grateful for. He responds swiftly and strongly. There is no place in our country for hatred or racism of any kind. It betrays the idea of the foundation of our very country. And we as mayors have to condemn, must condemn, we will continue to condemn any type of hatred or racist violence in the strongest possible terms. When I became mayor of Louisville a little bit over 10 years ago, we established compassion as one of our founding values here in our city. And by compassion, we mean respect for every one of our residents so their full human potential is flourishing. And we extended that value of compassion as a priority with the conference to promote compassion and equity anytime that we could, in any instance that we could. So this webinar has been organized as part of the conference's work on our Center for Compassionate and Equitable Cities. And it's going to take all of us to work together, as we so frequently say, and to stand up to injustice anytime we see it, to make our city and our nation more inclusive so that people of every race, national origin, and ethnicity feel safe, secure, and accepted, and not just accepted, but embraced and celebrated for who they are and all the beauty they bring to our country. So let me now introduce an outstanding mayor and board member of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Mayor Lilly May of Fremont, California, who's going to moderate this session. Mayor May, thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you, Mayor Fisher and Tom, for being with us today and for that kind introduction. I'm Lilly May, Mayor of Fremont, California, which is also a city that treasures compassion. And like many Chinese Americans, I too have experienced discrimination throughout my life, whether it was as a child growing up in Pennsylvania in the Vietnam War era and having faced some of that directly as a student and as a community member, where I was wondering why people were upset or hating on my family and not understanding how we could discuss this topic that's so raw and emotional. Or even more recently now, even here in this era and day, when we have this conversation, I too have experienced this during my past elections and just in the community in general. I was shocked to see how some of these conversations, because of the rhetoric that is being discussed with COVID, would lead some people to create allegations when I was creating information and asking people to be conscientious of the COVID-19 impact, that I would be called out as a communist, I'd be called out as a spy, and to watch sometimes people who are even bystanders or longtime friends not speak up, including fellow electeds at times. I think we owe this as community leaders and to make sure that this conversation is being held and discussed. It's so important that we now, in the situation that we have facing as a country, we want everyone to know today that this is something we're inviting all of you to be part of this conversation. And in fact, this is open to the press, and C-SPAN is recording today's discussions. The horrific murders in Atlanta shocked our nation and brought it all to a head. And the violence inflicted, as Mayor Fisher mentioned earlier, inflicted on a 65-year-old Filipino woman Monday in New York City is beyond pale, but not all that unusual. Today, we are honored to have with us John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, who will provide an update on anti-AAPI incidents and violence and some advice for mayors about what they can do in their cities to prevent and respond to these incidents. And we are especially pleased to have two officials from the White House, Howard O., the Associate Director of the Office of Public Engagement, and Gabe Oy, who's the Associate Director of the Office of Internal Governmental Affairs. Howard and Gabe are going to brief us on some of President Biden's actions to respond to anti-Asian violence and hate crimes. And Batting Cleanup is a real leader, a good friend, and of the Conference of Mayors and a past president, Burnsville Mayor Elizabeth Kautz, who will discuss her thoughts on the current situation and what she's been doing in Burnsville to make the AAPI community feel included and safe. So let's get on with it. John Yang, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Mayor May, and thank you, Mayor Fisher, for your opening remarks and setting the stage for all of this. I thought what I might do is talk about where we are, how we got here, and where we go from here. And all of you have seen the news. I appreciate both Mayor May and Mayor Fisher talk about the most recent attack in New York and obviously the murders in Atlanta. So what we are seeing over this past year in terms of where we are is between an organization called Stop AAPI Hate in California and our organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, there are about 4,500, a little bit north of 4,500 reports that we have received, self-reports, voluntary reports of anti-Asian attacks over this past year since February of 2020. Now, to be clear, of that 4,500, about 90% of that would not qualify as a hate crime. It would fall under the category of what we might call bullying, or it involves spitting, coughing. It would involve racial and ethnic slurs and things of that nature. So sort of as we think about a response, one thing I would ask all of you to remember is that there is potentially a law enforcement element to it, but a lot of what our community is looking at doesn't necessarily deserve a law enforcement response. It's just this notion of how do we protect our community? How do we make sure that our community feels safer during this time period? Now, in terms of how we got here, I think both Mayor Fisher and Mayor May started to outline some of how we got here. And that is, number one, there COVID-19, right? COVID-19 produces fear. That's understandable. Health fears, economic fears. And when people are fearful, they look for a target. And unfortunately, especially with respect to the prior president and certain other policymakers or people with media voices, the Asian American community was made a target of that fear and made to be a scapegoat of that fear. Now, so there is that we have to wrestle with. And the fact that the previous administration is gone, there's still clearly a ripple effect. But I also want to emphasize that independent of COVID-19, this is going to be an issue that all of us are going to have to continue to grapple with. And what I mean by that is that, look, our geopolitical tensions with the Chinese government are real. There are absolutely things we should be calling them out on, whether it is free press, whether it is the treatment of Uyghurs. We should be doing that. But when we do that, we need to be careful not to make a link such that the Asian American community back here in the United States becomes that scapegoat or becomes that target. And unfortunately, we've seen that happen in the past. Mayor Fisher alluded to it, is that when we were in World War II, the Empire of Japan legitimately was an enemy of ours, but that did not mean that Japanese Americans should have been treated the way they were. We saw that after 9/11, when, yes, there were terrorist attacks on our soil, but that does not mean that there should have been a backlash against our Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian American communities. So in terms of framing, one thing that I would ask all of you to remember is that this will continue and that we need to be smart in how we talk about some of these challenges that we face. In terms of where we go from here, so there's a few thoughts that I have. First is just remember that for the Asian American community, what we are grappling with typically is two stereotypes. One stereotype is that of the perpetual foreigner. This notion that no matter how long we've been in this country, whether we are born in this country, we are seen as a foreigner. We are seen as an other, and therefore we are seen as something less than, sometimes subhuman, and that we are not deserving of respect. And so that is one narrative that we must continue to call out and recognize that Asian Americans are on the front lines in addressing COVID-19, whether it is in grocery stores, whether it is on farms, whether it is in health professions. Number two is with respect to these stereotypes that we're facing is on the flip side is what we call the model minority stereotype. The notion that Asian Americans really should not be complaining. There's nothing to complain about because the perception is that we are doing fine economically on an education level. We're doing above the median, so to speak. And when we break that down, that's just not true. Yes, it is true that there are Asian Americans that are doing well, but just like any community, there is a gap. And frankly, the wealth gap between the lowest in the Asian American community and the highest in the Asian American community is the largest gap of any community here in the United States. So making sure that we're mindful of that stereotype as well. In terms of where else we go, I think Mayor May and Mayor Fisher hit upon it is we need to continue to speak out about these issues and to make sure that people understand that this is real. Certainly, if you talk to your Asian American constituents, this is not just in the back of their mind, it is in the front of their minds. And you should not be fearful of raising the topic because this topic is on their minds. So we would ask you all to continue to speak out at your press conferences, at different events that you have. The fact that President Biden spent a full minute during primetime coverage of his speech a few weeks in talking about sort of the COVID relief package was meaningful to our community because it made our community visible in all of that. Number two, I would say is make sure you meet with your Asian American constituents because again, they need to be seen right now. They need to feel like there are people that are looking out for them and being protected. So try to host some events to make sure that you give them that space because there is this feeling of pain, there's this feeling of suffering. And part of it is for them to have that ability to recognize that people in positions of power are seeing them. Number three, on a tactical level, consider creating a task force of some sort that would address these issues. And when I say a task force, please don't just focus on the law enforcement aspect. Yes, that is absolutely an aspect that needs to be addressed when we're talking about hate crimes and the violence. But that task force needs to include mental health because of the trauma that a number of these victims have. And again, the victims are not just the hate crime victims, but the victims of the spitting, of this coughing, of these racial and ethnic slurs. This task force should include community groups that are working on these issues. This task force should also include sort of other elements within your government structure that could think about how we get into the education space, whether it is with school districts, to make sure that we have the proper history, proper narrative. And the last thing that I would offer is what we call bystander intervention training, and making sure people are aware of what they can do if they see hate in front of them. Candidly, with respect to the New York event, as angry as I was about the attack on that woman, I was even more furious with the 3 individuals that did nothing. And not that they did nothing during the attack. Look, one of the things I recognize is we don't want to put anyone in physical harm's way. I don't know what exactly those 3 individuals were facing during that attack themselves. But after that attack, the fact, and the video shows this, the fact that they first closed the door to the building, did nothing for at least about 2 minutes before they decided to go out, makes no sense. And so what the other piece is, speak up, at least find ways to talk to the victims if you don't feel like you are equipped to do something in that moment. Find the tools that you have so that our community members feel a little bit more safe. Obviously, I'd be very, very happy to engage in further discussions about all of this. It's a topic that's important, not just to our community, because the reality also is, as you all recognize, we're in a moment of racial reckoning here in this country. And to me, to our community, this is a segment that is part of what we saw with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and that we need to show solidarity across all these communities of color, have these courageous conversations with all of our different communities about what we are seeing and what we can do to address it together. So thank you very much. Again, I'm happy to answer questions. With that, I will turn the mic over, so to speak, to Gabe Oye to talk about what the White House is doing, which is fabulous from my perspective.
Thank you, John. And thank you, mayors, for having us here today. Again, my name is Gabe Oye from the White House. And my other White House colleague, Howard, and I would like to provide a detailed update on what the Biden-Harris administration is doing to address the rise of anti-Asian hate and violence that Mayor Fisher and John mentioned in their remarks. In his first week in office, President Biden signed a presidential memorandum condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders here in the United States. And as John said in his first primetime address to the nation, the president also condemned anti-Asian violence as un-American and called on every single American to stand up against it. Following the tragic murders of the 8 individuals in Atlanta, 6 of which included women of Asian descent, the president and vice president went to Atlanta to meet with Asian American leaders to denounce the anti-Asian violence and the gender-based violence. Additionally, senior White House officials from the Domestic Policy Council, the Office of Public Engagement, the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, and the Gender Policy Council have all convened roundtables and listening sessions with Asian American leaders across the country to discuss the rising hate incidents. Following all of these sessions with Asian American leaders, the Department of Justice has also announced that combating anti-Asian violence is among the department's highest priorities, and that taking a fresh look at ways to reinvigorate the department's hate crimes enforcement and prevention initiative to identify ways that we can improve and expand data collection and reporting. Additionally, the Department of Health and Human Services also hosted a listening session with Asian American leaders to discuss equity in the nation's COVID-19 response that was mentioned previously, and also announced combating xenophobia as one of the top priorities of the COVID-19 Equity Task Force. And last Friday, the National Day of Action and Healing, the White House Office of Public Engagement hosted an event with our senior advisor, Cedric Richmond, and the National Asian American Chamber of Commerce to discuss the rise of anti-AAPI hate and the direct impact on AAPI businesses across the country. In the first 60 to 70 days of this administration, President Biden announced that the official policy of this administration is to condemn anti-Asian bias and violence. President Biden has also called on Congress to pass the COVID-19 Hate Crime Act that was sponsored by Senator Hirono and Congresswoman Meng. And he also created a historically diverse administration. 15% of all appointees, like myself and Howard, identify as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Howard, who will go over actions that was announced this week.
Thank you so much, Gabe. And thank you to all the mayors here for your continued thoughtful leadership. So earlier this week, actually on Tuesday, the president released a fact sheet announcing additional actions to respond to the increase in acts of anti-Asian violence, including reinstating and reinvigorating the White House initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, with an initial focus on anti-Asian bias and violence, coordinating across federal agencies to combat anti-Asian bias and violence, especially anti-Asian violence at the intersection of gender-based violence. Over the coming weeks, the administration will meet with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander leaders and organizations to hear the recommendations for the initiative's mission, structure, and community engagement. And the president will appoint a permanent director to lead the initiative in the coordination of policies across the federal government impacting Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. Funding for AAPI survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault was also announced, with the Department of Health and Human Services allocating $49.5 million from the American Rescue Plan to a new grant program for community-based, culturally specific services and programs for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault who face additional barriers, such as language access barriers. President Biden also directed the establishment of a Department of Justice cross-agency initiative to address anti-Asian violence. This included reinstating the department's hate crimes enforcement and prevention initiative focused on the rise of hate crimes in the AAPI community, publishing a new interactive hate crime page on its Crime Data Explorer website to ensure transparency in the nation's hate crimes data, and supporting community efforts led to shine a spotlight on acts of anti-Asian violence, removing language access barriers to hate crimes information, partnering with community-based organizations to expand public education and awareness about hate crime reporting, prevention, and response, and also holding nationwide civil rights training events to promote state, local law enforcement reporting of hate crimes. Health and Human Services also announced the establishment of a task force subcommittee on structural drivers of health inequity and xenophobia, with an emphasis on advancing health equity for specific Asian communities, including the Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian communities who have disproportionately been infected by and died from COVID-19. Also, the National Endowment for the Humanities is launching a virtual library, which includes resources for educators, civic leaders, arts and humanities institutions, and families to explore Asian American history and address the history and ongoing challenge of anti-Asian discrimination and racism in the United States. The Biden administration, we are committed to working hand in hand with leaders, civil rights organizations, and communities to advance fairness, opportunity, and inclusion for all. Thank you all for inviting us to speak. Thank you all for your leadership, and thank you for addressing this in your cities. Gabe and I are here to continue resources, so please reach out anytime. We're humbled with your time. And now passing it off back to Mayor May.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Mayor Kautz, who will share some of her personal experiences and her insights as a leader for the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Welcome, Mayor Kautz.
Thank you, Mayor May, and thank you for your leadership in this space. Thank you, President Fisher, for your leadership in our Center for Compassion, and to Tom Cochran for the leadership of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and all of the activities that we need to address with everything that's going on in our country. What we're experiencing is something that everyone has spoken to, that it is something that we cannot tolerate in our country. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to go on and talk to you about what I did here in my community right after the Atlanta massacre. And then what we've been doing in my community since I became mayor in building the building blocks. As you see in my background, in 2019, we started our effort, another building block. This is a brand that we have that everybody belongs here in Burnsville. So I use this as my backdrop because I want people to know that when you think about Burnsville, you're thinking about a community where everybody belongs here. So the day after what happened in Atlanta, I decided that I wanted to make sure that I connected with the people of my community, my Asian American community. I went out to all of the stores in my community where I know there are a lot of shoppers, Target, Walmart, Costco, and went around, handful of business cards, and I went up to Asian Americans and I introduced myself told them who I am, handed my card, and I asked them if they lived in Burnsville. Most of them did. I asked if they felt safe, and they said they did. Those who didn't live in Burnsville but worked in Burnsville were very appreciative that someone cared enough to ask them how they were doing and if they felt safe. That didn't mean that my community members didn't feel safe, but they know me and they know that I have been there. And I keep doing that. This morning, I went for my last shot at the hospital for COVID-19. And we had nurses, Asian American nurses. And I went up to them, handed my card, introduced myself, and asked if they were safe. They didn't live in Burnsville, but they do work in Burnsville at our hospital. And they were very appreciative. People need to know that they're cared about. People need to know that we know what's going on and that we're going to reach out. And so this is what I have been doing. I also went to the business where I get my manicure and pedicure. It's run by Vietnamese women. And I asked them how they were doing. I asked if they felt safe, and they did. I also asked if they had a plan and to be vigilant. And they didn't have a plan. So I helped them to work with a plan and what they needed to do. And I handed my card to each one of the women who are in there. And I said, everybody is involved in all of this. You see something, call 911. And they were very appreciative. So these are practical things that mayors can do on an ongoing basis. So about 15 years ago, what we did in Burnsville was to make sure that people knew that they were cared about. And we launched I Love Burnsville, which goes on. It's still very active today. What is I Love Burnsville? Throughout Burnsville, our community is integrated and we're a very international community. So there isn't a Chinese neighborhood, a Somali neighborhood, and so forth. Everybody is integrated within the neighborhood. And what we wanted to do was to help people get to know one another. We believe that when you get to know one another, then you're not going to be afraid of that person, or you're not going to see that person as the other. That person belongs as a part of your neighborhood. So we had different activities for about a week, and then everybody did that. But we also built onto that with our Night to Unite in August, where we go out with our police officers and everybody and go out into the neighborhoods and meet people and talk to them and help them to understand what their city and their law enforcement can do to help. So all of these things that we do are building blocks. We even went into our schools for I Love Burnsville, and our third graders write an essay about why they love Burnsville. And what comes out of those, and oh, by the way, we partner with a bank, a credit union. And what that credit union does is give $25 to each student who wins and to the teacher. And they write these essays. So every third grader in all of the schools in our community are asked to write about it. What comes out of those essays is not only the park system that they enjoy, but what they find is that they feel safe in the community. They also like their neighbors because everybody is different, and they talk about that. And I find that very refreshing. And we do this on an ongoing basis and continue to build the building block around all of this. Mayors, what I think we need to do is to be courageous. We need to be out there in our community when these things happen. Because I can tell you from my experience, when you're out there as a leader, your community members realize that they are no longer invisible and they are recognized. One of the biggest, one of the primary values we have here in Burnsville is mutual respect and inclusion. That's why you belong here is important. This is about a community that welcomes everyone and is inclusive. So one of the things that I want all of us to understand as mayors, is that little things like going up and asking when these tragedies happen throughout our country and find out how our people are feeling helps a great deal. Last summer, during the riots and protests in Minneapolis, which is just down the road from me, what my community members know is that I'm there for them. They talked to me about wanting to have a protest. They talked with me about a rally. And we said, what do you need? One of the things is that they didn't want police presence. My police chief was with me. And we said, okay, we won't have police presence. However, we need to know how you're going to communicate these rallies and these protests, because if it goes sideways, we need to make sure the community is safe. They understood that. And I also said to them, this is your home. You are a partner in helping us to ensure that our community is safe. You have the right to free speech, you have the right to rally, but at the same time, you have an obligation to make sure your home, your community is safe. Let me tell you, we had peaceful riots and we had peaceful protests and we had peaceful rallies. I also said to them, do you want me present? One of the rallies that was put together by young people, they said yes. So I was there, the superintendent of schools was there, and so we had the leadership of the community there from the Chamber of Commerce. But what we did was we made sure that people knew that we were there to support them. They had their rally, 2.5 hours, everybody disbanded, but people felt heard. They felt that they were heard. And even the protests, I was there sitting with some of the women, talking with them, and they felt that they were cared about. They weren't invisible, and that the leadership of the community came and listened and sat. And so what we need to do, mayors, is make sure that we're out there front and center so that our people know that we care about them and they're not invisible. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Kautz. And thanks to John, Howard, and Gabe for your excellent and helpful presentations. I would just like to add that in my own city of Fremont, I've heard some of the same conversations, which is it enough just to do a proclamation? And what more can we do to unite our communities in these challenging times? And some of the things that we did early on in our city is when at first the Wuhan virus, as it was called, was coming out, we were very concerned about the repercussions on our small businesses, in particular some of our restaurants. And so myself and one of our council members, we were part of a press conference that covered a lot of the local restaurants, and we pulled in some of the local ethnic media to make sure that people understood that there was no rational fear in terms of going to those businesses and to speak out for them. We also, as a city, worked with our police department as well as the DA to create what is a hate crime brochure. So we have that information. We also created public service announcements so that people could see some of those examples of what we're thinking. And in fact, most recently, the DA's office has formed a special task force to focus on these Asian hate crimes and racisms. We also worked closely with community-based organizations. Many of us could already sense some of the conversations and the uprising in terms of the frustration of being COVID cooped. And so whether it's working with other fellow elected organizations like AAPI or APAPA, which are Asian organizations for electeds, or working with our Citizens for Better Community, or even community members, a lot of people came out in force in partnership with so many other organizations such as Rotarians and others that helped with donations of PPE and supply and aid. In this time period when so many of our frontline workers are struggling, and we just celebrated Doctors' Day, and our nurses and our frontline workers, there was many opportunities where the community came out, restaurants, business owners, and these organizations, in particular in the API community, to say, we are part of the solution. We are not the problem. We are here to work with you to address the concerns and needs for the people. I also want to thank my fellow mayors who joined me at the Alameda County Mayor's Conference, because it wasn't enough that our city did it alone, but that united all of the mayors of my conference for the county joined in a resolution. And in fact, not only did they not just stop there, they continued to also have this conversation with their own communities. So it was something that was a ripple effect that then amplified within our Bay Area region. Some of the other things that have been occurring that has not just to do with this day, because it's not just about anti-Asian API. It's about making sure that every person deserves to be welcomed in our city. We are a compassionate city. And some of the things that we value and treasure is the diversity of culture, heritages, and faith in our community. So we also celebrate every year an interfaith worship day, a day of peace, interfaith Thanksgiving, where we gather and we recognize and learn from one another. My former experience, I served 2 terms on the school board, and I was the state president for Asian school board members, and I'm the immediate past president for National League of Cities, also for APAMO. And what we've learned is that we need to have this constant conversation. And it's not just about the Asian leaders themselves, it's about the communities that have the Asian population, to give them a voice. As John Yang mentioned earlier, when it comes to education, I think that it is a struggle that we face so many times, that when we're talking about racial disparity and COVID access, that we're not recognizing that there is such a wide breadth of economic and educational opportunities within the Asian community itself too. So it's important that we highlight those so that people recognize that it's not just one stereotype. And certainly also right now, when we talk about what's being said, it's important that we highlight what's being portrayed in the media too, that we recognize that you cannot just stereotype people into either over misrepresentation in terms of being nerds or being dragon ladies or other things. I think it's important that we have just normal, people that are in the community. And so that's what we're hoping. And at this time, I'd like to also turn it to my fellow mayors and others for conversation and questions. And so I'm going to pull that up to see if we have some questions. Are there other examples that you would like to give? John, is there anything, or actually, if you don't mind, Mayor Fisher, before you leave, I know that you've done so much in your city of Louisville. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to share.
No, I think one of the points that we keep emphasizing is what is the work that you do to prepare for when a tragedy or an incident of hate happens in your community. And you beautifully kind of spoke to that. Our interfaith tradition here is really strong, so that we're constantly pulling people together that normally would not interact with each other, because isn't that what's really at the root of otherism, is they don't know each other, so they think they're so different. So isolation is our enemy. So more we as mayors can think of 365 days a year of intentionally bringing people together that normally would not interact with each other, builds the kind of social muscle that we need. So when a tragedy transpires, the city coalesces together. And so that you can make the best out of a worse situation. And hopefully, as we've seen in many of our cities, off of the tragedies of last year and out of the marches for racial justice, we're emerging as stronger cities. We will be emerging as a stronger city and emerging a stronger nation as a result of these hate crimes that have been perpetrated toward our API community in the country as well, because people are talking about it. Their consciousness is being expanded. And that's part of our role as mayors with our secular pulpits to make sure that takes place.
Thank you. As I said, I know that Howard and Gabe had to leave us, and I know John will stick around.
Mayor, one of the things I think is important is what John was saying, and that is sometimes we jump to hate crimes real fast. And there was a lot of confusion in the sheriff in Georgia as to what the mayor was saying. And we all know that so many of the crimes that we have in the country come from states and not from the federal government. But I think the instance that John used that are not hate crimes, but they're awful, dastardly acts, is something that the mayors might be thinking about in the way of a task force and, into the schools. So you know, as Laura and I are listening to this under the leadership of Mayor Fisher with our Compassionate Center, we need to, you know, delve down and just see if we can come up with some best practices and thoughts about this.
I absolutely agree. I think that's one of the things that people have talked about, that children, when you look at them in schools, are not taught to hate. And that's an opportunity that we educate early on within our students. As far as some of the, what is defined as a hate crime versus like spitting or chasing people around or using racial slurs, we acknowledge that there may be questions at times as to whether victims are targeted because of their race or ethnicity. However, we work closely with all of our police as well as our community leaders in terms of, and legislators, in terms of what will be determined as a motive. And with any of these types of crimes or incidents, we investigate them fully and thoroughly to consider the facts in terms of whether or not they equate to hate. I also wanted to invite, I know there's been a question. I know Mayor Couts, you started earlier with some introduction and talked about your background. And I was wondering if you would be so kind as to share a little bit of that with us too, personally.
Thank you. I did see Mayor Ashcraft's question, and sorry, I sort of skipped over that, but yes. So I'm biracial. Let me give you my father's heritage. He is, my father is, heritage is Danish and English, but my mother is a Pacific Islander. She is Polynesian from the island of Samoa. And so that's what you see. And when I came into office 26 years ago, in Burnsville, there were only 8% minority, 8% minority. We are now, I'm waiting for the next census, but our demographics in Burnsville is probably about 30 to 40% minority and very integrated, very international in its makeup. So these are the things that I think really makes for a great and healthy community, and the things that we do, not only with our faith community, because we have an interfaith, we have 3 mosques in our community. And so we are very interactive with all of them. But one of the things that's going on as we continue to look at You Belong Here in Burnsville is that one of our Lutheran churches has put together this task force for inclusion. And what was interesting in what they had shared with me, that the makeup of the whole group was all Caucasian, all white, 1 Asian American. And Becky told her story of what it was like to be in our community and to be in this task force and to feel like that she was invisible. And it opened the eyes of many of the people there. So I think having a proclamation and doing resolutions and all of that is great. That's great. That's a one-time thing. I think it has to be every day. Every day we are doing something. Every day we are building those building blocks to change the culture and transform the way that we see each other and how we behave as a community. And so it just takes a lot of work and a lot of heavy lifting, but we can do it.
Thank you, Mayor Couts, for sharing that. It means a lot to hear about your background and also to recognize all the efforts that you're doing in Burnsville.
Yeah.
Some other efforts that I also want to recognize is that when we talk about the community and giving outreach through different faith and ethnic groups, Fremont is actually the 3rd largest API city in the United States based off the percentage of population. So it is an Asian majority city. And it's been one of the things that I've been so pleased to see over the last couple of years is the diversity and representation, whether it's on the school governance team or here at the city council itself. We have gone from being, I was the 8th woman councilwoman in our city's history and our first woman and female mayor, to seeing now where we have our first Black councilwoman, a majority Asian council, and also for the first time in our city's 65-year history, a majority women council, coming from a place where there is a 35-year period with no women at all on the council. Other efforts that I think are important when you talk about everyday efforts and how can we expand this outreach. When I was on the school board, I was the president of the Asian school board members. I thought it was really important. One of the things that we brought also was the Council of Presidents, working with the California School Board Association and their governance and board of directors, so that it wasn't just a representative being a Black at large or an Asian at large or a Latino at large or Native American. It was all of us regularly meeting to talk about the issues that pertain to our students and our community. Other efforts that have been done here in Fremont, because we have such a diverse heritage, we have the largest Afghan population outside of Afghanistan here in our city. And we also have many faith-based groups, as I mentioned. And so I know that we had a civic community leader, one of our human relations commissioners, also go out and have a Meet a Muslim discussion. So these continual conversations are ways that we can embrace and learn and educate one another about the richness that our cultures and heritages bring to these conversations and make us such a blessed community to live in. And that one that we hope in this time period, when it's easy to get divided, when it's easy to be frustrated and to face these challenges, to recognize that together everyone achieves more and that we spread hope when we help one another. I also see that I would love to invite, if I think that one of my fellow city mayors is making a comment, and I don't know if he would like to join the conversation. If he'd like to, he could raise his hand, because I saw Mayor from.
David, can you help us with this?
Sorry, I'm trying to pull up his name.
Yeah.
Would you like to share with us? Ken?
He's coming on up.
Mia. Okay, I apologize. I saw that he was sharing with us, but he was mentioning that his city manager and his assistant city manager are also Tongan, and that they represent about 1.6% of the population. But
Sorry about that.
There he is.
Oh,
Sorry about that, Mayor.
There he is. I was trying to find him.
I don't know what happened. Usually,
Islanders. Yeah, Pacific
Can I-
Islanders. Yeah, Ken.
hey, how you doing there, Mayor?
Hi, thank you, Mayor. We got me.
You know, I remember you. I didn't realize you were from, your dad was or mom's from Samoa. So yeah, our city
my
manager.
parents are not. My parents are Chinese in ethnic heritage.
Oh no, I was talking to Mayor Couts.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mayor. Yeah, no, and I remember meeting with you all. So
Yes.
no, I was just kind of bragging. You know, so not only is our city manager Samoan, he was actually a former NFL nose tackle. I mean, his job was to kill quarterbacks. So he played for Houston Texans, the Patriots, but he's a great guy. And our assistant city manager is Tongan. So yeah, go figure. You know, here in Las Cruces, and Asians, we're probably like 1.6% population. But in fact, I had the minister of Japan come down a few years ago. Well, I met him in Albuquerque, and he asked me, he says, "Are you elected at large?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he goes, through an interpreter, he goes, "Really?" He goes, "How many Japanese live in Las Cruces?" I said, "I don't know, 20 families, maybe, lucky." And he goes, "I'm going to put Las Cruces down as a preferred destination there in Japan to visit." So I thought that was pretty cool. But I just want to lend my support to the mayors around the country. We've been extremely lucky here in Las Cruces, but I see what happens in other parts of the country, and it's just it's terrible. You know, my dad was also interned in camp. In fact, he passed away a few years ago, but he told me that the first time he went to Japan, he was 16, you know, after he got released from the camp, and they didn't like him in Japan because he was American. And so he saved up money, came back, and then he joined the military in 1948. He retired in 69. But when I would go campaigning, now I will admit in 1990, that was my first run in office for state rep in 1990. I was 26 years old. And yeah, this guy kind of he saw my name and he goes, "What kind of name is this?" And I says, "Japanese." He says, "I'm not going to vote for a Jap." And he pushes it back in my chest.
Thank you, Mayor.
John, can I ask you a question? And that is, can you comment on recent incidents? Is it geared more to Chinese recent incidents? Can you discern Japanese, Korean, Chinese? Is it geared more to Chinese, or is that just something we imagine? Or can you comment on that?
I'm smiling because at one level, for the mainstream population, the old stereotype of we all look alike does apply. So the statistics are that of these attacks that we've been tracking, this comes from Stop AAPI Hate, about 40% are Chinese American. But it goes across all of Asia, with the exception of South Asian Americans are not impacted in the same way. And actually Pacific Islanders are not impacted in the same way. But certainly Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and as well as Vietnamese, Laotian, Burmese have been impacted. We have reports from all of those communities, and it does extend to almost all 50 states. I think we're up to 48 or 49 states. So it is across the board, and that is something to be aware of. I think a number of people pointed this out, and this is absolutely correct, is that the degree to which it is gender-based is significant. So about 70% of the attacks are against women. So if you're thinking about resources within your communities, you should be targeting making sure that there's gender-based resources there. And then the last thing I would say is I want to make sure, again, to be centered around the victims is what kind of wraparound services do you have for the victims? Because for our community, yes, accountability of the attacker is relevant, but it's not critical, frankly. I mean, what we are more concerned about is how are you providing services to that victim? You know, if you are in a school, what sort of high school counselor is available to talk to that student? You know, what person will talk to the family of that student about what happened to help them process it all? So those are the types of things that we're really hoping that everyone can lean in on.
I appreciate your comments, John, and thank you, because I think that that's important. What I mentioned earlier, that we're Asian majority city, I also forgot to neglect to mention that we're also very large in terms of East Asian Indian and South Pacific Islander. And I know that sometimes when it comes to this frustration, it has also been targeted to them. I absolutely agree when I talk to my fellow women mayors in particular, that during this last time period, a lot of women have been focused on far greater in our elderly, just because of the stereotypes, I think, of being seen as a weaker opponent or authority. And that's why I really appreciate your conversation, Tom and Greg and Mayor Fisher, in terms of perhaps that's something that the conference could take on in terms of creating some list of resources and opportunities for us to be able to provide those. Because what the U.S. Conference of Mayors offers greatly to all of us is not just a venue for us to learn from one another, but an opportunity for us to amplify our voices and to be heard and to help assist one another. And this is no better time than right now in terms of being able to provide that for our communities. I'm trying to see if there's any other comments from my fellow mayors. I was just going to say that, you know, it's so important, and I have to thank all of you for taking this time to talk about this topic. It is at times very personal for me because it's something that has really moved my community, and it's something that I'm so grateful that we're able to have this conversation and to allow people to be able to share their thoughts. But this is not, like Mayor Couch said, one conversation and we're done. This has to be an ongoing effort because people in our communities, mayors, community members, businesses, and all need to feel safe and need to feel welcome. And that's something that I would pledge that we all need to do every day. And I thank you all for taking the time, the opportunity, John Yang for coming to share, Mayor Fisher, Mayor Shima, Mayor Couts, and for those at the U.S. Conference of Mayors who help us to amplify the voice. And I'm just so moved and thankful and wish you all the best as we work together to address COVID, to address reopening safely, and redress how we can build a better normal working together. So with that, I thank you for your time today and look forward to many conversations as we move forward. Have a great day. Be safe
Thank
and
you.
stay healthy.
Thank you for your leadership, Mayor May.
Thank you.
Thank you.